Good evening, this is Brown at I've Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Mighty Thor, annual number 15, or the Terminus Factor, part 3. So this continues from Iron Man annual number 11, and it does a pretty good job of picking up from it. And in this particular annual consists of 3 stories. The first of which is Can Terminus Be Far Behind, which is the 3rd chapter in the Terminus Factor. And it was written by Roy and Dann Thomas and illustrated by Herb Trimpe and Mark McKenna. A pretty good art team, if I must say so. And as far as the writing team goes, it's the exact same writing team that's written the parts 1 and 2 of the Terminus Factor. So there's definitely a nice form of consistency, from chapter to chapter, and part 3 is certainly no exception. And so in this particular chapter, this is where, quote unquote, one of the big guns is called in, or actually a couple of big guns, namely Thor, and because it's his book here, and Hercules. And so the two of them are called in by Tony Stark to help out with the Termini situation, because as shown at the end of Iron Man Annual 11, there was a whole swarm of animals that had been taken over by the infant stages of the Termini life forms, and basically, they were becoming like, sort of organic, mechanical, hybrids. And so, Hercules and Thor, they get called in, and they end up heading over to San Francisco, where an army of these animals seems to be headed towards. And basically, Thor and Hercules decide to split up. Thor goes into outer space, and to where the last known location of Terminus was, because the Avenger Quasar had been the one to last battle and defeat him, but left him floating adrift in, I believe it was the orbit of Neptune. Because he was basically unable to kill him, but at the same time he was able to defeat him. So Thor confers with Iron Man, and basically he decides to try and find out what the connection is between Terminus and the Termini below and on planet Earth, whereas Hercules is basically going to be the eyes on the ground, to basically keep an eye out for the army of Termini. And so Thor goes into outer space and eventually finds Terminus, floating around where Quasar had left him, and basically ends up literally, hammering his way, inside of Terminus. Because at this point, Terminus was, almost content to be left floating adrift in space, but, at the same time, he was defending himself against, any intruders, that were attempting to make their way towards him. And Thor, definitely being an intruder, was targeted by Terminus's defenses, and Thor is able to literally, hammer his way through with Mjolnir, the hammer, and his hammer, and he makes it inside of Terminus, and it's like he's inside of this organic factory. It seems like, because he's inside of a living creature, but everything's sort of like this mechanical organic mix up. And in the process of being inside of Terminus, he picks up on the thought patterns of Terminus, and ends up getting his origin, and basically how Terminus is the product of a long dead alien race's desire for revenge against a cosmic group of individuals called the Celestials, which are these godlike giants that have this whole incomprehensibly alien mindset, and some of Earth's heroes have encountered them time and again in the past, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. But basically, Earth has more or less been spared by the Celestials, for various reasons, and stories that I haven't yet read, but basically Earth's been declared sort of off limits by the Celestials, or if there is any sort of involvement, it's to say interact with on an individual basis with certain characters, as opposed to say a whole planetary involvement. But anyway, though, the Celestials had basically wiped out this one particular alien race, but just before they died, they were able to create these sort of, I guess you could say, almost the equivalent of nanite, life forms. And basically what they would do is, whenever they were seeded on another planet, they would basically come together and form a new life form, and that would basically take out the life on planets that the Celestials had spared. And so this was basically their long-term plan for revenge after they had been killed by the Celestials. So once Thor finds this out, he understands kind of the mindset of the creatures, the Termini back on planet Earth, as well as the mindset of Terminus himself. But unfortunately, that's when Terminus's biological defense mechanisms kick in, and so Thor is attacked by an increasingly diverse range of organic defenders, and basically Thor is the equivalent of a germ, or a disease that's attacking Terminus's body internally, and so his body's treating Thor accordingly. And whatever power Terminus is packing, it's enough to basically keep Thor down for the count and deprive him of Mjolnir. And somehow Terminus's biological defense network is able to commandeer Mjolnir, the hammer, Thor's hammer, to open sort of a dimensional sort of portal, to where he's able to make his way to planet Earth. But in the meantime, though, on planet Earth, Hercules, he finds out that the Termini are making their way to this nuclear power station in San Francisco, which is basically where Tony Stark and crew were able to determine that's where the animals were, where the creatures were heading towards, but they didn't know it was going to be that power station. So Hercules gets there, and basically right in the middle of a bloodbath, and the staff personnel have mostly been slaughtered, and so Hercules gets in, and but unfortunately it's at this point that the Termini they attack the containers that contain the nuclear fuel for the station, and once they have exposed themselves to it, they start to further mutate, and this time into a more humanoid army. And Hercules gives it his all, but unfortunately, he is soon defeated by these things, because there's like a whole army of them, and as strong as he is, they are even more so in a group. And so they eventually all merged together into a new form of Terminus. And once it's born, that's when the original Terminus himself, comes down from space, and the two of them prepare to face off. The real Terminus and this newly born form of Terminus. And so that's where that's where part 3 ends of the Terminus Factor, and it's to be continued. But I thought that this was a pretty good further chapter in the Terminus Factor story, and I appreciate how within each chapter the threat further escalates, and the Termini further evolve from one form to another. And so you really get a increasingly dangerous cosmic threat. And this is my first time actually having read anything about Terminus. And so when I saw just how deep his backstory was, and also just how major of a threat he was, it really sold the fact that this is something that really cannot be solved by, say, just Captain America or Iron Man, and not even Thor. And I mean, Thor for sure, gets some results in the story, but he is defeated. And the fact that he's deprived of Mjolnir by, as far as I can tell, a non-magical being, but this is like strictly all technological. That's a threat elevation that speaks volumes. And I also liked how guest star Hercules. I liked his portion of the story as well, because he's confronted with the horror of the situation, in a sense that these Termini have slaughtered just about everyone at the nuclear station. And I gotta say, Trimpe and Mark McKenna, when they're drawing said slaughter, even though this is like a code approved comic book, it's surprisingly brutal. Like, it's not an all gore fest, but you see just enough to realize that people are actually getting killed here. And so I thought that really conveyed that, along with the good writing by Roy and Dann Thomas. That all conveyed the danger of the situation. And also when you see the Termini further mutating into more humanoid forms, they did a good job of putting the reader in the shoes of Hercules, where he's expecting one threat, but then he's confronted with life form that's literally changing into something else right before his eyes, and he's not powerful. He's not strong enough to stop him. And so it was a pretty good, I guess you could say, planet side perspective on things. Since Hercules was bound to Earth at this point. And so I enjoyed part 3. And I definitely want to see how parts 4 and 5 turn out. And I'll go ahead and give the Terminus Factor part 3 4 5 stars. It was good. It was consistent with the writing and plot developments that had transpired within part 1 and part 2 prior to this. And the artwork, as usual so far, has been done very well. There's like a dynamic energy to the combat scenes, and also just the artwork in general. it looks like something that it looks exciting in a comic book sense, but it also looks like something that when bad things are happening, there's a real element of danger, to the proceedings, and so I really appreciated that though. So just because this is an annual storyline or crossover storyline that's eventually going to be resolved, that doesn't take it away from the fact that we're getting a story here that has a very potent threat, and people are getting killed, and so I really appreciate it about this story. And so that was part 3 of the Terminus Factor, and this particular annual, unlike the Iron Man annual, which came before this, this one just has 3 stories instead of 5 or 6, and in a way I actually kind of appreciated that, because it allowed for, on one hand you have the Terminus Factor Media Watch, which is something that's been going on both in parts 1 and part 2 of the Terminus Factor. It's like you're seeing a perspective of what's going on with the Termini from the perspective of news reporters on the ground. And so the writer was Gary Barnum, and the artist was Richard Bennett. And so, much like the media watch in parts 1 and part 2, it's a very short take and kind of a recap on what's been going on with the Termini invasion so far. And it does a pretty good job of, basically putting the reader in the perspective of, say, someone who's, just like an average Joe who's maybe watching something on TV in the Marvel Universe, but then, suddenly their regularly scheduled programming is interrupted for, this, breaking news, possible emergency situation, or I shouldn't say possible, it is an emergency situation involving, an alien threat, and the fact that, some of Earth's top heroes have proven, less than effective in stopping it. And so as the stakes have increased in the main story here, you also get that perspective, when things on the ground are spiraling out of control, and basically, you're put in a situation where the newsroom's saying, please stand by, this is an emergency, and I liked the fact that they did that to give you the perspective of someone who's just a civilian in the Marvel Universe watching TV and seeing what's going on here, and all they know is what the news is telling them so far. And so they're not in the perspective of one of the heroes like Captain America or Iron Man or Machine Man or Thor or Hercules, who have basically been in the thick of things trying to fight the Termini, so they don't know all this cosmic agenda stuff that Thor's found out or anything like that. They're just it's the perspective is from just ordinary person, and they did a pretty good job of that. And so, as short as it is, I'll go ahead and give it 4 out of 5 stars. The media watch portion, and it's just as good as it was in parts 1 and part 2. So they did a good job of continuing that. All right, so the third and last story in this annual is called The Return of the Thermal Man, and the writer was Randall Frenz, and the artists were Gary Hartle and Mike DeCarlo. And so the this particular story, it's a standalone story, a standalone Thor story, and it's independent of his Terminus Factor storyline. But anyway, though, it has him going up against an old foe of his, the Thermal Man of the title. And this was a robotic being that had been created by a scientist in the Chinese who was involved with the Chinese government, and basically he had invented this robot, as basically the prototype of a new breed of robots to do geological or labor to revolutionize the study of Earth and the science involved with it. But since this was taking place in China during a cultural revolution, he was arrested for dissenting opinion. This particular scientist was, and all his designs and schematics were taken by the new authority and power, and they created this thermal man, this robot. But instead of using it for scientific research, they went ahead and weaponized it and used it for military warfare, namely against the United States. And so apparently, I forgot which comic books it was in, but Thor was the hero who ultimately battled and defeated the Thermal Man, and originally, but the Chinese government several years later they've been conducting some research in the Arctic, and in the process they inadvertently brought the Thermal Man back to life, because that's where the Thermal Man had more or less been laid to rest. And so the Thermal Man ends up going out of control and attacking basically anyone it gets its hands on, or anything it gets its hands on. And it has this all-encompassing drive for destruction, but also of revenge against the last person who defeated him, which was Thor. And so while Thor, once he finds out what's going on, he ends up going up against the Thermal Man in battle, and basically he ends up getting hurt quite badly, because of how powerful a Thermal Man is, and basically just sort of like I guess it's like being hit with the heat from a volcano, point blank, is how powerful the Thermal Man is, more or less. And in the meantime, though, the Chinese government, they try to get the scientist who created the Thermal Man in the first place, to work with them to try and create kind of a fail-safe mechanism to break through to the Thermal Man. And so things are kind of up in the air on whether or not the scientists will be able to one, complete the project in time, but also will it actually work? I mean, mind you, the Thermal Man's been buried for a couple of decades at least. And so also on the meantime, over in Asgard, there's an encroaching group of frost giants, and unfortunately this is occurring at a time in which Thor had been exiled from Asgard, and he's been more or less confined to the Earth realm, and Midgard, I think is what they call it. But they were trying to get him to come back and help repel the invasion, but he's saying no, this whole exile business was agreed upon. I'm sorry, I want to come, but I can't leave right now, because if I do that, this enemy I'm fighting may well destroy a good portion of humanity. And he's talking about the Thermal Man at this point. And but he does come up with a rather cool, unique solution in terms of dealing with both the Thermal Man as well as rendering aid to Asgard to repel the frost giants. And I will say that particular solution that he comes to use was pretty inventive on his part. So yeah, I'll go ahead and give the Return of the Thermal Man 4 4 out of 5 stars. It was another good story. It was a nice little standalone story, and I thought that the writer did a good job of recapping the prior events involving the Thermal Man. Not just necessarily in his interaction with Thor, but also just his backstory in general. And so basically, I didn't necessarily have to go all the way back just to find the issues that he appeared in Thor to understand his story. I mean, they did a good job of recapping what went on the last time Thor and Thermal Man mixed it up, and so I appreciated that. And I also liked how there was like almost a Cold War vibe in regards to the Chinese government and their interaction with the scientists who they initially had thrown into prison because of the whole Cultural Revolution, but also how they're reluctantly having to release him from prison to help the Americans, because if the Americans are destroyed, then they know that the Thermal Man's more than likely going to go for China next, and so or at the very least it's going to destroy or try to destroy all of human civilization in general. I mean, that's just how powerful it was, and how eventually evolved into something that powerful. And so I liked how that, with that whole Cold War vibe, they got it to where it's like, yeah, it's the Chinese government, they don't have the interests of Western civilization at heart, or they don't have the best interests of Western civilization at heart. But at the same time, they also realize that hey, we if we just let this destroy the Western civilization, we're probably going to be next. So yeah, we need to help them out. And so I kind of appreciated that aspect of it, and of the story, I mean. And also I kind of like the scientist. I forgot his name, I'm sorry to say, but the because you kind of have a good portrayal of someone who has come up with a good idea, but not only are they thrown in prison before they can even implement this idea, but that idea they have is ultimately used to an end that is totally contrary to what they originally had intended. Namely, I mean, the Thermal Man was initially designed to be like a geological I guess labor robot, but instead was used for conquest in the interest of the Chinese government. And so you got a real sense of the betrayal that the scientist felt, but you also see how he's also trying to redeem himself, because in his eyes he's a true patriot to the Chinese government, and he's wanting to not only redeem himself for the perceived public failure on his part, but also he is wanting to help out humanity in some way, even if his creation is ultimately being turned against humanity. He does want to try and save humanity. So I did like that bit of character development with the scientist, because you understand his bitterness at being betrayed by his government, but you also see the drive and motivation he has to help humanity out, which is ultimately what he was trying to do in the first place with the creation of Thermal Man. It was turned against him. And so yeah, I appreciated that they give us a well-rounded human character, even if just for one story, and this is the only story he appeared in. But yeah, so like I said, The Return of the Thermal Man, 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good standalone story. And also, real quick, I just wanted to say the artwork by Gary Hartle and Mike DeCarlo, very reminiscent of Jack Kirby, who was the co-creator of Thor, by the way. But yeah, they did a really good job of having like similar designs, for the characters, but also for the fight scenes as well. So yeah, definitely props to them for making it still look like look like it's taking place in the 90s or late 80s, early 90s, but at the same time they have that definite Jack Kirby vibe to it, and so that sort of epic feeling is definitely being maintained. And so it was a good story to read. It was fun to look at also on a visual level. And there were also 2 pinups, or 2 posters, if you will, or 2 pages that could be used as posters if you want to take them out of the book. But one of them had some early artwork by Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy, amongst other things. And I'm not sure who the character was, but it kind of made me think of the DC Comics villain Calabac. But I highly doubt that was who it was supposed to be. It just kind of looked like him. But on the other hand, there was a pinup shot of the character of Loki by Charles Vess, and I really thought that was good here. But I'll show you real quick. All right, bear with me just a moment. So yeah, this is the pinup of Loki by Charles Vess, and I really liked it. Very moody, does a very good job of capturing the mischievousness of the character. You just know he's plotting something. But here's the Mike Mignola picture right here, and you can see some monsters on the ground below this guy here. And once again, I'm not sure who he is. He looks a lot like Calabac, like I said, but I do like how some of these monsters, especially this one right here, if you look carefully, you can see the horns on his head, and he does kind of look like a early prototype version of a Hellboy, but I'm not sure who the monsters are supposed to be. Probably some underworld creatures or something. But anyway, yeah, so good pinup art, but I especially like the moodiness on the picture of Loki as done by Charles Vess. And so yeah, that was Thor, the Mighty Thor Annual number 15, with the main story being the Terminus Factor Part 3. I really enjoyed the book, and it was actually I actually liked this one better than the Iron Man Annual overall. I mean, the Terminus Factor storyline was just as good, but in terms of the quality of stories, though, it seemed like whereas the Iron Man Annual had a bigger quantity of stories, this book had a better quality of stories. In the sense that they had a lot more space to work with in just 2 or 3 stories, as it were. But yeah, this was a good book. And I definitely want to finish reading the Terminus Factor storyline. There's just 2 more chapters to go. Excuse me, 2 more chapters to go, and I'll definitely be doing part 4 soon, or reviewing part 4 soon. So thank you for taking the time to check out my review on the Terminus Factor Part 3, and I hope you all have a good night. Goodbye.